Born in Princeton, New Jersey, and raised on the Jersey Shore, Rick first moved to the far side of the Atlantic to study architecture at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London. Returning to the United States, he moved to New York City to complete a master's in architecture at Columbia University. But the seeds of a life abroad had been sown in London. Rick spent the 1990s mostly in Stockholm, where work took him further abroad to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and to Kuwait. These assignments led to further work abroad from Sweden, with 3 years in Malta, which were formative for Frame 39, followed by London again, then Qatar, Abu Dhabi, Oman, Riyadh, before a return to London, where he now continues to reside. He was once accurately described by a colleague as a peripatetic American architect, which has nothing to do with uh, philosophy, but means that you're like itinerant. You travel around, right? Is that what that means?
I just travel around exactly.
None unlike the journeyman masons of old. Oh, well, that's interesting.
Yep.
His transition from architecture to literature grew from an abiding fascination with the idea of architecture being like stage sets for innumerable, indeterminate dramas. Frame 39 grew out of his numerous travels, his sojourn in Malta, and his time at Multicultural Melu of Abu Dhabi, where he began the writing. Well, whoever wrote this introduction is a wordsmith for sure. Um, Rick, welcome to the Big Fat American Podcast. I'm Zach Martin.
Yeah,
It is
thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's great. I've been looking over your podcasts. I'm now a subscriber.
oh well, thank you very much. I
Yeah,
appreciate
yeah,
that. It's
very
an honor.
interesting.
Before we get into some questions, and being that you're a learned individual, you went to Columbia, you studied abroad. Here in New Jersey, we have the pork roll dilemma. Is it Taylor ham? Is it pork roll? You got to make a decision for the rest of us stuck in New Jersey.
Oh, I tell you, look, it's now 35 years that I have not lived in the United States, so I'm going to have to abstain from that question. Um, can't
Well,
really offer an opinion on that one. Sorry.
so once again, New Jersey's stuck with the dilemma between calling it Taylor ham and pork roll, which is a Saturday morning, Sunday morning delight at the Jersey diners throughout the state and all 21 counties, to which you could order your Taylor ham or pork roll. But it really depends on where you're from. Most people would say it's Taylor's pork roll, but there's those of us who call it Taylor ham, which is just another way of saying fried bologna. But I digress. Let's delve into your book, Frame 39. Rick, your new book,
Yeah.
Frame 39, was just published by a New Jersey based publishing house, Rebel Book
Yes.
Press, which is woman owned and operated. And I'm told you're an architect that lives in London, but you lived abroad in Dubai, Malta, Sweden, and even more places. But you grew up here in New Jersey. You can't answer anything about the Taylor ham pork roll dilemma, but can you
Sorry
tell
about
us about
that.
growing up in New Jersey and how that's affected you worldwide?
Um, yeah, that's kind of a hard question. I was thinking about that. I spent my first 6 years in East Brunswick, New Jersey, which of course is not too far from Newark, not too far from New York City. And one thing I thought of, if do you know the film Stand By Me?
I've heard of it,
Have
but I
you-
don't think I've watched
Yeah.
it. I'm
Okay.
not I'm not a big film.
It.
I'm not a big film guy.
Oh, you're not. Okay, fine. It's based on a novella by Stephen King, and as a film, as a movie, it took place out in Oregon. And what struck me about that was that it was almost like something out of my own childhood, minus the body. There, of course, it's Stephen King. There's a body involved, but it could have just have been out of my own childhood from the late '50s. So there was this kind of interesting. Stephen King said it in Maine. The movie took place in Oregon. I grew up in New Jersey, and yet there is this Americanness about it all the way across the board. So, I wouldn't, in some ways, I wouldn't say there is anything all that particular about New Jersey. Although a lot of my friends, I then moved down to the Jersey Shore, or what became Bruce Springsteen country, And a lot of my friends were second, third generation, from immigration from where I am now over in Europe. And yet it was never something that was all that maybe of interest to us. We were all just kids, whoever we were, regardless of what our background was. And so, yeah, I mean, there might be something of a connection there. I mean, America might be a flawed melting pot, but in the town where I grew up, it really felt like a melting pot. We were just all, kind of equal kids, so to speak. And so then I actually went to London, here to London, for 1 year of study, and I ended up staying for 4 years. And then, as you said, I moved back and moved to New York City, which of course is a melting pot in and of itself. There, it always has been, and then moved back again to Sweden, expecting my first child, actually, and ended up spending 10 years there. And so, being over here, I guess I started to notice how the territoriality and the kind of, where you're from was more important over here than I experienced it, at any rate, growing up where I did in New Jersey. And that, I guess, kind of slowly filtered through and fed into the overall life experiences that I've had, that ended up reflected in Frame 39. Um, Frame 39 has as its catalyst to the story the fictional decision by the Church of Sweden and the Church of Malta to create a center for world ecumenism, to bring together all religions in a facility in Malta. And the story goes that a Swedish architect is selected to design this, and he comes down to Sweden. He comes down from Sweden to Malta, and it's decided that he'll take a series of trips to various buildings or places that are representative or part of the cultures of these different religions. So he goes on a western loop of the Mediterranean, an eastern loop, and then off to Mumbai, India, through India, and then across all as far as Kyoto in Japan. Always going to churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, etc., and so forth, including some ruins as well, and the ruins in Malta, which, by the way, are really quite fascinating. But the story starts off with an American filmmaker, Jennifer, who discovers a canister of a roll of film floating in a tidal pool in Newfoundland, where she's off on a retreat, planning to write a film script. And she gets these pictures developed and becomes completely fascinated by them, since they're taken from obviously places across a large part of the globe, and seem to be religious places. And she decides that she's going to try and actually reconstruct whatever this itinerary was, and go to each one of these places, which she pretty much succeeds in doing. So the telling of the story alternates back between the architect John's journey and the filmmaker Jennifer's journey, back and forth, going from place to place, basically. So you see John at Chartres Cathedral in France, and then Jennifer at Chartres Cathedral in France, and so on and so forth. And of course, through each of their separate journeys, they meet different people, and there are different dialogues, and different things come up. And so in the end, if there is anything that is ecumenical about it, it's the entire novel, with the various voices, the various people expressing their thoughts, and so on and so forth, echoing back and forth through the whole story, and you get in the end a kind of a collage of a large group of cultures, religions, and points of view, aspirations, and so on.
Let's go back to New Jersey. I think that there's something more to uncover here. We both grew up on the Jersey Shore, and I could tell you that I grew up in a very poor town near the fish factory in Belford, where the fishing fleet would be. And
Okay.
we all, every day, we'd get up and we all go out and fish at White Bridge and have our rods and get some snapper, come back home. So
Yeah.
the ocean and the bay became a way of life for most of us, from boating and what have you. And not having, at the time when we grew up, many of the distractions and entertainment that's available now, video games and what
Mm.
have you. I always, in my mind, was always exploring and really fascinated by the old buildings that were surrounding me, the old railroad that didn't work, the
Yeah.
switches and the boxes, and traveling along and hearing the tales of how the railroad ran across the ocean, and one time a hurricane drives through and it gets all wiped away, and then you get the remnants of the old bridges, and then you had the folklore that was in the area. I think that for both of us probably would have an effect as we go about throughout the world. And when we get into these creative type of arts, it's got to have an influence on us. Would you say that there's something to
Oh,
that?
sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, in fact, since you mentioned these various things, to drill down a little bit more into that story, Stand By Me, in the film, what happens in the film is the boys walk along a railroad track over a trestle bridge, and they're heading towards looking for a body in that case. But in fact, my when I was six, for my sixth birthday, my father, who worked in Parlin, New Jersey, took us somewhere, and I was only six. I'm not really sure where he took us, but we took a walk along an abandoned rail line
Huh.
across a trestle bridge, set up a little campfire, had hot dogs and marshmallows, and in the distance there was again, I'm relying on my 6-year-old memory or conception and memory as well. What I think was an abandoned factory that was in ruins. It was a brick factory. The brick walls in some places were falling down, and the steel structure was revealed as well. And for me, that was quite magical. And I think that in a sense, it's probably fundamental to my becoming an architect in some strange way. And it also feeds into my interest, my abiding interest in ruins, actually. So yeah, yeah. The history of that area of New Jersey was really quite interesting.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's the crossroads of the Revolution. We've always had the
That's right.
stories about George Washington going through the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Monmouth, the Battle of Bordentown, and then the other Hasbrook Heights,
Exactly.
all of those things that really come together. And I just want to brag about New Jersey because we're always the butt of jokes, but really we're
Yeah,
an amazing state. You think about it, Thomas Edison, Albert Einstein, and many other greats all resided in the state of New Jersey and
that's
have
right.
influenced the world. So just wanted to give a nod to that. Now, at one point, you come back to New York City, and here's something else that we have in common. You had a hand in a place called the Limelight. I was there in 1986 filming for a video for Fitz and the New York Band. I'll never forget that as a
How were
operating
you?
floor camera. Yeah, and we're backstage. My dad was with me, and it was just uh, growing up, as you know, in the Jersey Shore. Chances are your grandmother brought you to church, so it was a little bit off-putting to see what was once a church turned into a nightclub with dancing cages and things like that. So, why don't you give
Yeah,
us a little bit of your behind the scenes of the Limelight and how you had
right.
a play in all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It was a little strange commission to be confronted with or offered. It was a friend of mine who had a friend who was an architect who actually received the commission from the owner, Peter Gatien. And it was a rather large project for him. So he was looking for somebody who could help him with it. And in the end, I actually basically did the project for him. And I must admit, it was a rather strange idea, but certainly a challenge. And then the interesting thing about it for me was that his offices were up in the attic of the Plaza Hotel. So for the time that I was working on that, I had a great view up Central Park for the whole time. But at any rate, it was certainly interesting working with Peter, Peter Gatien, on that. And he had certain ideas. Now the church is, of course, was and is a church building, but it had actually been deconsecrated some years before, and it was an Episcopal church, and the Episcopal Church had deconsecrated it and had sold it to a drug rehabilitation organization that finally decided that the church spaces really weren't working for them, and that they could probably make better use of the money that they could get from it by moving elsewhere, which they did. And they sold it to this guy who was coming. He was Canadian, but he was coming up from Atlanta and was specifically looking for a church to turn into a discotheque. And he found one. One of the things that I decided that we would do, he wanted to have, you mentioned cages. What he said he wanted were mezzanines and balconies for people to be looking down on the church floor, which would be the dance floor. So I designed a completely freestanding steel structure that was built inside the church, and also supported literally, it must have been nearly a ton of disco lights that he wanted to have in it. So, and my thinking was, well, one, it needed to be something like that because the church would never be able to hold that kind of weight. But then also, if it were ever to resume its life as a church, you could very easily take that steel structure out and return it to what it had been. Now, I understand that it's no longer the Limelight. I'm not actually sure how it's used,
It's
to be honest with you.
I pass it every so often. It is like a mall, you might say, like a
It's a market of some sort. Yeah, that's what I
market.
think
Yeah,
I heard.
it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
quite a mall, but you kind of get the idea. They have the kiosks in there and stuff like that. Actually,
yeah.
I have to say it's a more comfortable form of use for the property, right, based on its
Oh,
quality.
certainly. Yeah. Well, in doing the changes that we made, I was always thinking, everything that we're doing here, it would make a great theater.
Yes, it would.
It,
Actually,
it
it's a
would
great
work.
concert venue, to be honest. Yeah, it was.
It would have worked very well.
Well, let's
One
move
thing I
along.
recall, we out on the street talking, I think, with a contractor at one point. An elderly gentleman walked by on Sixth Avenue, and he said, "I hope you're not changing this into apartment buildings," which is what had happened to a smaller church just down Sixth Avenue at like 14th Street or something. And I just simply said to him, "No, no, no, don't worry." And he walked on, seemed to be content.
Well, moving back to frame 39, one of the characters is an architect described as being obsessive. Do you find that architects, and I guess they have to be, are really obsessive type of people?
Um, a A friend of mine described us architects as people who know a lot, uh, who know a little about a lot of things, but not a lot about any one thing in particular. As architects, there are a lot of different things that we get involved in, that we need to be involved in. The requirements of a client, of course, and the particularities of whatever that building might be, and the details, as you say. I think if we are obsessive, it's probably that long before any building that I've worked on has actually been complete. I have been in that building. I've been walking around. I can see it in my mind's eye. And it's probably in that way that somebody might say, Rick, where are you? And I say, well, I'm just walking around in this building that I'm working on. And in that sense, we can probably be rather obsessive. Yeah.
You get into to some really deep areas in regarding the spirituality and religion in Frame 39. And my take, it's a really big part of the fabric of the book. Maybe you can give us a little bit about your approach to that and what the audience or the reader can expect. A little expectation.
Um, yeah. The way in which the book came about was really rather strange. I mean, I wrote it in Abu Dhabi, and I wrote it back in 2013, 2014. And I must say it is, a shout out to Diane Lilly of Rebel Press Books, the publisher. Diane is somebody I know from all the way back in the 70s, in fact. It's because of her enthusiasm for the book, having read it, that we're doing what we're doing now, trying, publishing it and trying to get it out. Um, the it in one way it's like a detective story. You have somebody finding a roll of film and trying to reconstruct why those photographs were taken, who they were taken by, and so on. And then of course you have the aspect of traveling from, let's say, from Morocco all the way to Japan, and it becomes something of a travel log in a sense. But then, as I say, the overall effect is um, people of various religions, and this is, it's all building up really from people that I have met over the years. Um, and not that I'm, borrowing words directly from anyone in any particular character, but they're kind of talking to each other throughout the book, and I think that probably in the end, anyone will find their place in that conversation, and I think maybe that's the whole idea, is that you find your place in that conversation, of what your particular point of view, belief point of view might be, or not be, and hearing somebody else's point of view, somebody else's experience, and um, just kind of weighing where you fall yourself in that, and hopefully in some way you enter into the overall conversation that's going on in the novel.
Well, let me give you two follow ups to that, Rick. During your travels, did you say to yourself, yeah, God is real? Or did you think that God is more of a myth?
Oh yeah, I would describe myself as an agnostic, Zach, and by that I would mean that I take it as a form of humility, that I think that it's actually just simply beyond me to be to have certainty one way or the other on that. Um, God might very well exist, and God might very well be acting in the way that a lot of people will say God is acting this way, God is acting that way. You know, God is speaking through this text or that text, and I respect, really anyone and everyone with their particular beliefs. For me, it's more I just see the basic wonderment of the world, and appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone who, uh, if they are sincere, I appreciate their sincerity.
Fair enough. What is the biggest misconception that Americans have about places like Dubai, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East that you think is probably definitely inaccurate?
Um, The first thing actually that comes to mind, I think very few Americans realize that in countries like a little bit less in Saudi Arabia, but certainly Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, I don't think they realize what a minority the Gulf Arabs are in their countries. I think that in the UAE, the Emirati are no more than 20% of their country's population. It's the same in Qatar and in Kuwait. Saudi Arabia, it's a bit more, but there's a very substantial foreign population.
Mhm.
And I think that anyone who, certainly any American, and certainly looking at the way things are going in America right now, to stop and think about that, that would probably change one's perception of what those countries might be like. That's
Well,
probably the main thing.
I have a little bit of a different perspective that really made me think. I was going through
Mhm.
some archives, and I can't tell you where they are, but when I went into those archives, I found files, one marked Iran, other Saudi Arabia, various other places throughout the world, and it occurred to me that maybe there's a little bit more religious freedom than we realize in those countries. And perhaps our distortion of this religious freedom or how religion is expressed in these countries has to do more with the fact that we are Americans as opposed to other countries with their faith and how they can express themselves in those same countries, such as Iran. Just my observation. It just made me wonder based on
Yeah.
some files that I saw.
Well, yeah, I think you're probably right. I would say even more broadly that my experience of living in Sweden and living here in England, there is a certain obsessiveness with a lot of people about Americans in the sense that they are always feeling like they need to compare themselves to America. It's a very strong sentiment in Sweden, for example, and to a certain extent here, and it's usually, quite frankly, they always come out the better, over the Americans. So they see themselves, in a sense, as superior to Americans in one way or the other, and that, of course, follows in kind of naturally into other countries like Iran, like you mentioned, like Saudi Arabia. But if I take Abu Dhabi is actually where I lived down in the Emirates, which is next door to the more famous Dubai, although Abu Dhabi is much larger. And Abu Dhabi is where so to speak, federal government of the UAE is located. Now, there are two um, public artworks that I can think of in Abu Dhabi. One is a great big fat chubby cannon done in white marble, which is more cute than threatening. And the other is a bronze, I think, sculpture that spells out in English tolerance. And I think that's important to the Emirati ethos that there is this tolerance for people. I mean, there's near where I live, there was a mosque built and there was a cathedral built. There's a very large Filipino population, so they had maybe not a cathedral, but a church, and the two of them sit on either corner of a block, and between them is a parking lot. And the practicality of that is that on Friday the mosque uses it, and on Sunday the church uses it. So
That's pretty funny.
there definitely is, and it varies from country to country to be sure. But yeah, there's a lot more nuance to it than people might think.
Well, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time on that topic. I think it's important to get a different perspective on the reality versus the reality, and everybody's reality is distorted. Hey, we go back to philosophy where we started. Where's your book sold? Frame 39.
Well, I'm here in London, and the book takes place in Malta, in this part of the world. So I'm quite keen on seeing it available over here, and certainly in the United States. So universally, obviously, it's available on Amazon in all its various dot forms, .com, .uk, and so on and so forth. It's at Barnes and Noble in the United States and other online venues. It's still early days, and it's obviously a very competitive market in terms of fiction. So we're Diane and I are in the middle of building that up and getting it out there and getting the word out. So I appreciate very much that you've invited me on for that.
Well, it's great to have you here. I always enjoy talking about subjects like this, especially a fellow Jersey boy who understands those old abandoned railroads and the
Yes,
crumbling buildings, but has an appreciation for the wreckage. Rebelbookspress.com. You can find out more information about Frame 39. Also, go to frame39.co.uk for more information.
yes.
Rick Shands, thank you for joining us today.
Zach, very much. Thank you. Thank you.